Chapter 8, Heart and Blood Vessels, Screencast 1. Now, Chapter 7 focused on the first part of the cardiovascular system, blood. This chapter, Chapter 8, is focusing on heart and blood vessels, so the remaining structures that together make up the cardiovascular system. Now, the first thing that we're going to be looking at are blood vessels. And overall, there's 3 different types of blood vessels, and their job is to transport blood. Capillaries are going to be a little bit different. So let's kind of work our way through this. Now, an artery, that is defined as any vessel that's carrying blood away from the heart. And on the arterial side, there's going to be a much greater pressure. So pressure is the driving force to move blood through the circulatory system. So that's an important thing to keep in mind. And that's the role of the heart, to actually generate that pressure gradient. Because arteries have to withstand higher pressure, they have actually a thicker wall. So let's kind of take a look here. And we're looking at some differences, okay? And there's 3 layers, so that's something that they all have in common. Now, the hollow interior, that's called a lumen, okay? Then there's going to be an inner layer, okay, tunica intima. Then there's a middle layer that's mostly smooth muscle. Now, both arteries and veins, as you can see here, have smooth muscle, but the muscle in the artery is much more well-developed. And then there's an outer layer of connective tissue. You want to think of arteries as a pressure reservoir, whereas veins are going to be a volume reservoir. So veins can actually hold a lot of blood without an increase in pressure. So we'll see why that's important. And then as we kind of go our way, we have the heart, arteries, arterioles. Then we have capillaries, venules, veins, and then back to the right heart. So that is the general circuit that you can kind of expect. Now, capillaries are exchange vessels. And so that is where the exchange of nutrients, waste products, all of that is actually taking place. And we want to remember they're arranged in beds and are actually microscopic in size. The diameter of a capillary is enough for red blood cells to move through single file. Now, veins, they actually are returning blood back to the heart. They're thin-walled because they don't have to handle as much pressure, but they need to be able to handle a large amount of blood, so they're stretchy or distensible. Now, the structure, so we're going to focus on arteries first. They're going to transport blood away from the heart once again, and they're thick-walled, and we want to make sure that we're comfortable with what the layers are. The innermost layer is an endothelial layer, a simple squamous tissue. The middle layer is smooth muscle, and then the outer layer is connective tissue. Now, as I said before, arteries are carrying blood away from the heart, and they do so under great pressure. Now, because they're under great pressure, they're at risk to develop what's known as an aneurysm. And an aneurysm is a defect in the arterial wall. So one part of the arterial wall becomes weaker. And what that does, that creates a ballooning. Okay? Now, depending upon the direction, they're going to cause different problems. An inward bulge will actually obstruct flow. More common, you see an outward bulge. Now, these are things that actually develop over time, so they're chronic in nature. The unfortunate part is typically they're symptomless until they rupture. 2 general places where you might see an aneurysm, an aortic aneurysm, and a rupture of the aortic aneurysm can rapidly be fatal. There are also cerebral aneurysms, and they can also be fatal if they rupture. Now, generally, an aneurysm can be detected through screening, and they can be surgically repaired. Now, here, what we want to look at is the general flow. And capillary sphincters and arterioles actually regulate flow. So let's take a look at the order, and this is something you should be comfortable with. So we have the heart, to arteries, to arterioles, and capillaries. So this is what this particular diagram here is depicting. So arterioles, they're the smallest of arteries, and what we're going to see typically are precapillary sphincters. So precapillary sphincters, they control blood flow from the arterial to the capillary bed. Okay, so that's something we want to kind of keep and remember. So here we can see the precapillary sphincters. If it's vasodilated, then blood will move through that capillary bed. Here we can see that they're vasoconstricted, and notice there's no blood flow through this series of capillaries. Now, when you vasodilate, that is increasing flow. The vessel is actually becoming larger. Vasoconstriction, that is actually when those capillary sphincters constrict, and that is going to decrease blood flow into capillaries. Now, you're also going to see the terms vasodilation and vasoconstriction to describe what's happening to the smooth muscle in a vessel. So vasodilation is relaxation of that smooth muscle, and that lumen will get larger and increase blood flow. Vasoconstriction is going to be constriction of that vascular smooth muscle and decreased flow. So something to keep in mind here what those terms mean, because they really are important. Now, capillaries are the smallest of all vessels, and they're most commonly called exchange vessels. Now, they're microscopic, they're thin-walled, and they're only one cell layer thick, and they're porous. Now, capillary beds form an extensive network, and what they do is they result or are for the selective exchange of substances with the interstitial fluid. So transport is what's actually taking place here. So nutrients are being delivered, and metabolic waste is actually being picked up and moved into the vessels. Now here we can actually see a pattern. So here's the arterial, there's the venial, and so notice this precapillary sphincter is open, and notice what's happening. Okay, so I've got the interstitial fluid here, and then there's that tissue. So oxygen, nutrients, raw materials are actually moving in. Carbon dioxide are going into the venial side of the capillary. But something else is going on here. So notice what's happening here. So because of the higher pressure, fluid is being moved out of the vessel and into the interstitial space. Now that's called filtration. Now a large part of this fluid will actually be reabsorbed into the capillary bed. So that's reabsorption. So that's something else that's happening. Now, if there's a greater amount of filtration than reabsorption, then what's going to happen here is swelling or edema, because that fluid will accumulate here in that interstitial space. Now, the lymphatic system, which does not have a chapter in this particular textbook, what it does, it maintains blood volume. Because remember, some of that excess fluid in the interstitial space is not reabsorbed by the capillary. So something has to pick it up, and that's what lymphatics do. Now, the lymphatic system also plays a role in immune function, and we'll address that when we do immunity. Now, when we look at the structure of a capillary, of the lymphatic vessels, they have blind-ended capillaries. Now, the lymphatic vessels, if I had to pick the side, arteries or veins that they're most similar to, they're most similar to veins. That's important, okay? And lymph, that's basically the interstitial fluid, and once it moves into lymphatic vessels, it's called lymph. Now, we're back to veins. Now, the role of a vein is to take blood to the heart. Now, volume. So veins are designed to hold volume. So think V for volume. And you may want to think of them as a volume reservoir. Now, it's also important on the venous side to return blood back to the heart without any significant increases in pressure. Okay? Now, when we look at veins, they have a much larger lumen, okay? And they're stretchy. Okay? That allows them to hold more fluid without an actual increase in pressure. So let's look at the flow. Now remember, veins are taking blood back to the heart. So we're coming from capillaries to venules to veins and back to the right heart. Now, as noted before, you want to think of the veins actually serving as a blood reservoir. At rest, okay, the majority of blood is on the venous side of the systemic circuit. Now, there's a number of mechanisms, because remember, on the venous side, we want minimal pressure. But there has to be a way in which we can make sure blood is moved back to the heart. One is called the skeletal muscle pump. And remember, vessels are going to be embedded or surrounded by skeletal muscle. And when that muscle contracts, it's going to squeeze and force that blood in an upward direction, especially in the lower extremity. Here we can see what's happening with the calf. Another characteristic of veins is that they have valves. And so as that blood is squeezed upward, it can't go backwards because of the valves. You squeeze again and it moves further up. Okay. Now the other thing is the thoracic pump or respiratory pump. Within the thoracic cavity, as we breathe, there's changes in pressures. And what happens, those changes in pressures actually pull blood up to the thoracic cavity and back to the heart. Now here, we're going to start talking about the heart. Now, what this figure is not showing is the actual sac that the heart is sitting in, which is called the pericardium. Now, the heart actually has 3 layers. So this is where we want language to help us. Epi, that is the outermost layer. So that is a thin layer of epithelial and connective tissue. The myocardium, that's the thick part. Okay, that's the actual cardiac muscle. And cardiac muscle is what we actually call myogenic. It actually generates its own electrical signals for contraction. So that is going to be found within the myocardium. And as I said before, the contractile force is generated by the muscle itself. The endocardium, that is going to be the innermost layer of endothelial tissue, and that is continuous with the lining of blood vessels. So one of the questions I commonly ask is list the layers from either innermost to outermost, so that would be endocardium to myocardium to epicardium, or outermost to innermost. In that case, it would be epicardium, myocardium, endocardium. Now, this particular image here is the image that will be on the exam, and these are the structures that you are responsible for. So you will be required to label some of these structures on the upcoming 3rd unit exam. Now, when we look at the structure of the heart, it's actually made up of 4 chambers. The upper chambers, right and left atria, and then the lower chambers, those are the ventricles, and those are the workhorse. Those are the ones that are generating the majority of the pressure. We want to think of the heart as 2 pumps in one. The right side is going to move blood through the pulmonary circuit, whereas the left side is moving blood through the systemic circuit. Now, there's also 4 set of valves, and you need to know what they're separating. There's 2 atrioventricular or AV valves. They're separating the atria from the ventricles. We can see them here. On the right side, another name for that valve is the tricuspid. And on the left side, bicuspid. Okay, so those are the common names that you'll see overall. Then there's semilunar valves, and we can actually see them here. You're only really seeing clearly the right semilunar valve, and the semilunar valves are separating the ventricles from an exit vessel. Here, the exit vessel is the pulmonary trunk. If we were getting a closer look, and you can sneak it and see it right there, okay, where that arrow is, that is the left semilunar valve or aortic valve, and that is separating the left ventricle from the aorta. So you want to be comfortable with those valves. And also, once again, this diagram here and the corresponding structures that you see. You'll be responsible for labeling all of the structures that you see here, potentially. Now, as noted before, there's 2 circuits. There's a pulmonary circuit, and that's what the right side of the heart actually does. It's going to move blood out of the right heart into the lungs and back to the left heart. Now, the left heart is responsible for moving blood through the systemic circuit, and that's the rest of the body. Okay, so let's kind of take a deeper look and run through the numbers. Okay, so here we can see 1. These 2 vessels, they're the superior vena cava and the inferior vena cava. And so they're going to move blood into the atria. And so notice what's happening here. The atria to the AV valve Okay, there's my right ventricle, and here's the pulmonary trunk. The pulmonary trunk will branch into the left and right pulmonary arteries. And what you want to remember here is the pulmonary arteries are the only arteries in the body that are actually carrying deoxygenated blood. Now, what's going to happen next is they move to the lungs. Okay, I've got 2 lungs here. And then notice 7. Okay, so 7 are pulmonary veins. Now, pulmonary veins are the only veins in the body that actually carry oxygenated blood. Now, they both drain into the left atrium through the left AV valve. And then what we're going to see is through the left semilunar valve or aortic semilunar valve into the aorta. And then we're going to look at the head and upper limbs. And here we can look at the torso and lower limbs. That's generally what we expect to see. Now, then it's going to go through the capillary beds for exchange, back onto the venous side, and then all the veins, okay, the veins of the lower extremity basically merge into and form the inferior vena cava. The veins of the upper extremity merge and form the superior vena cava, and they both drain into the right atrium. So here we see that closed system of the circulatory or cardiovascular system. Now here, generally, what we're going to see are arteries and veins paired together. Now, I'm not going to ask you to know the names of arteries and veins, but just to kind of give you an example, okay, we already kind of introduced the inferior and superior vena cava. I have a jugular vein, but carotid arteries, subclavian vein, subclavian artery. Okay, so you get the idea. Okay, so keep in mind many of these vessels, arteries, and veins are close to each other, and they're named based on the anatomical area they run through. Now here are coronary arteries and veins. Now the heart, as a pump, has a high demand of oxygen, but it cannot access any of the blood that's moving through the heart itself. So it has its own coronary circulation of coronary arteries and coronary veins. Now, typically, when you look at a diagram, red is going to be an artery, and that's because it's carrying oxygenated blood. Veins are going to be blue. Remember, they're going back to the heart, and they are carrying deoxygenated blood. Now, remember the exception to the rule. The pulmonary arteries are the only arteries in the body that carry deoxygenated blood, and the pulmonary veins, they're the only veins in the body that carry oxygenated blood. So that's important to remember. Now, when we look at the coronary arteries, these actually supply the heart muscle itself. Okay, so they're very small in diameter. Now, when someone is experiencing a heart attack, or when we talk about coronary heart disease, really what we're talking about is a blockage in these arteries. Now, they're not very big. That's an important thing to remember here. They do not have a large diameter. So it doesn't take a lot for them to actually be blocked. Okay. Now, the coronary veins, they're typically going to collect the blood from the myocardial capillaries and funnel the blood back to the right atrium. So the important thing to remember here is the heart has its own circulation. It has its own set of arteries and veins. And if I look at the right coronary artery over here, that's coming off the aorta, as does the left coronary artery. Okay. Now, a blockage on the left side is going to be far more dangerous than a blockage on the right side. So that's something to keep in mind also.